The following is a presentation of Geekster Media.
Hey there, and welcome to episode 3 of the Geekster Geek Out podcast. On this show, we give interesting people who are known for their fandom of a particular corner of pop culture a chance to geek out about another obsession they are rarely invited to discuss on any other platform. So this time around, we have a man who knows his way around vintage snack packaging as the mind behind collectingcandy.com, who has become the History Channel's go-to guy for the facts and packs of our favorite treats on 5 seasons of the food that built America, including this season's The Mega Brands. He's also the saint who brought us so many nostalgic scans of Sears Wishbook catalogs from days gone by at wishbookweb.com. But did you know he also worked as an editor at Marvel Comics and wrote action figure packaging copy for Toy Biz in the 90s? Now, as fascinating as all those experiences were, we're diving even deeper into the geeky world of pop culture as we explore this gentleman's connection to the world of retro gaming. So, Jason Liebig, it's time for you to finish the phrase I never get to talk about.
Classic emulation.
Classic emulation, video game emulation. So when I reached out to
Yeah.
you, this is something that you're like, I kind of know something about this. I guess I was pretty involved. But
Yeah.
let's go back to the beginning real quick with
Okay.
video games in general. This vintage era of video games popping up in 70s, 80s. So
Yeah.
was that for you, your first experience? Was that an arcade? Was it home console?
No, I mean, for me, I was around during the birth of really nationally distributed arcade games. So I was around when Pong hit the scene. I was a kid, I was a young kid, but I remember there was a Pong set up at a bar restaurant that my mom worked at. I think it was a tabletop. And I was obsessed. My brother and I would go in there and I would just look at it. And of course, as a kid who grew up with, well, a world without a lot of technology, right? There were pinball machines. But when I saw Pong, I was like, what is this? This is magic. You can move the things on the TV screen. You can control it. So I was pretty obsessed. And then it grew from there. So I got to experience everything, firsthand. It was Space Invaders, Asteroids, Pac-Man. I remember the first time I saw Pac-Man. I remember the first time I played Donkey Kong. And I remember thinking the first time I saw Donkey Kong, which was I think 1980, and I was like, my God, will the graphics ever get better than this? I actually said that. Because I said, oh my God, it's a you can actually make out that that's a guy. So yeah, so that my early experience with video games was very early, and I was immediately in. I was definitely one of those kids that couldn't wait to get a roll of quarters or tokens and get to the arcade once arcades existed.
Yeah, exactly. Like you say, like, because my first experience too, I remember tabletop Pac-Man in like the lobby,
Yeah.
like while waiting to get a table at a restaurant, and just like, this is what am I doing? So,
Uh, yeah, the first time I saw Pac-Man was a place called W.C. Frank's, which I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It was basically a hot dog themed restaurant, and this was in the Midwest. So we were in another town, a place called Grand Island, Nebraska, and this W.C. Frank's had a Pac-Man machine. And apparently, like, you could just never get on to play it because people were always like kind of online to play it, right? They were just waiting. And it was just it was that level of obsession. I mean, it's hard to fully comprehend if you weren't there, but it's just like any national craze. It was a craze, and it was fun. It was exciting. There was always something new coming down the pike. So it was, yeah, it was wild.
now, did you get to a point where, okay, now I'm bringing them home? Did you have the Atari? Did you have ColecoVision? Like, what did you have?
Yeah, no, I mean that sort of ties into the topic of today, like the idea of being able to play video games at home. I remember we had a store that was like a big box store, like a Kmart, but it was called a Tempo, which again was another Midwestern store. And they would have also Sears though, would have their Atari 2600 set up, right? And as a kid, I would like go in there. Oh, I just love this. And then we only were able to get an Atari when that Tempo store went out of business, and they kept marking everything down, and they had finally marked down their like last three Atari 2600s. I think they had them like at 75% off, but they were non-functional. So they said if you fill out this, like, this is the receipt, it's new. If you just send it into the company, you'll get your Atari. So we got our Atari, I think for like $50 because they were still so expensive back then. They were like $300. And then we sent it away to Atari with the receipts and everything. And then I don't remember how long it was, 3 months later. This is what, this is what a single mom gets, right? It's like she has to really earn it and work for it. But no, we got our Atari 2600. And then it was, oh, I gotta play, they did it because I remember playing Space Invaders on Atari, which was a pretty damn good conversion. Probably really the best arcade conversion on Atari. Still really playable. But yeah, so anytime there was an arcade conversion that was bringing it home, I had to get it. And they were just awful. If you ever played like Atari Defender, right? Defender is this amazing thing, but Defender on the Atari, because you instead of having like 7 buttons and a gear over here to move your ship up and down, literally there's all these buttons. You had one joystick and one button. So just adapting that game to one joystick and one button had to be a challenge. And they did what they could. And it was, I mean, I played the hell out of it, whatever. I spent like a month of my paper route money on that game. And then, of course, Pac-Man came out, and it was famously just like terrible and dissed. I liked it, but again, it was the guy, he couldn't even move up and down, because the technology, the Atari 2600 was so weak. But what they did with it was pretty amazing. So yeah, and then Missile Command came out on Atari. I remember that. That was actually pretty good. So yeah, so any chance to get those games at home was a childhood obsession. And then when you mentioned the ColecoVision, when the ColecoVision came out, I do remember getting a ColecoVision, and that had like this really good version of Donkey Kong. I look back and it doesn't look that good, but at the time it seemed like it was exact. Like, oh, this is exactly what Donkey Kong looks like in the arcade. But it was really playable. It had all the levels, so it was. Yeah, so that was the reason why I bought a ColecoVision, was just for Donkey Kong. So that was
Yeah.
great. And then a few years later, of course, Nintendo came out, and then that
Yeah, that's what I
really,
was gonna say because like I was a Nintendo kid. My older brother,
yeah,
he had all the Atari stuff growing up. So like I remember playing Empire Strikes Back on the Atari, and when you go, like you're zooming through space and that, like just there's a little transition. I'm just like, this is amazing. Like
yeah.
at the time, that's what we thought was doing it. Was getting our
No,
attention.
I mean those little pixels, whatever the blitter or whatever they had, the thing to get these little blocks. It's like it was all so amazing, and some of those things kind of hold up. I know I've gone back and played all the old games or whatever, but like Atari Space Invaders is actually, because it's got like 100 versions of the game, Invisible Aliens. It's actually pretty good, even now, if as good as Space Invaders is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great, still to this day, a primer for younger kids. Like my
Oh my
kids
God.
played the Atari. I have that little Pac-Man controller
Oh
that has all
yeah.
the games programmed in. And my son forever will be connected to it because when he was like
Wow.
2, he pulled it off the table and it hit him in the face and scarred him. So he has a Pac-Man scar from wanting to
Wow.
play Pac-Man. So but it'll get you there. But here's the thing. So yeah, like you say,
Yeah.
in the 80s, getting into the 90s, the
Yeah.
technology, the graphics, everything is jumping up till we're getting to the PlayStation, and we're like, can you believe it?
Yeah.
But then at this point, towards the late 90s, people are starting to get nostalgic for the
Yes.
old games, and this concept of emulation comes up. So before we get into your particular history,
Yeah.
for those who don't know, what exactly is video game emulation?
So emulation, there's two ways to bring an arcade game home. There's an adaptation, which is what we do on the Atari, right? They say we're going to try to reprogram this game in this system, right? So they would just look at the game, they would program it. Emulation is what they're doing, is they're literally going in and creating a program that completely mimics the original chips, the original circuit board, everything about the original thing, and then they just plug the code into that emulation software. So it's almost, well, it's basically it's a virtual version of that original system. And so the idea there is to completely replicate it to every single piece of the original hardware. That's it. So that's emulation.
Yeah. So then how did you first find out that this was even a thing, discover this software?
So I think in preparing for today's appearance, I went back and I remember my first experience with emulation might have actually been in the late 80s when I had a Commodore Amiga, and someone came out with a Commodore 64 emulator for the Amiga where you could run some Commodore, I think it was called like A64, or it was like Ready Soft C60. They might have been called the 64 emulator or something. And I remember being super excited because I was a Commodore 64 kid, and then I got it for the Amiga. It wasn't that functional. It was great to see that original Commodore blue screen come up on my Amiga. It kind of worked, it kind of didn't. And then I would say the sort of transition, the sort of bridge to real emulation for me was a thing that I saw came out from Microsoft in 93, God, 31 years ago, called Microsoft Arcade, where they did not emulate, but you could have fooled me. They gave you completely perfect adaptations of things like, was it? It was Asteroids, it was Tempest, Atari Tempest, Centipede, and a couple other games, and they were amazing. But they were there to basically pump Windows, to basically sell Windows. And they would come up in Windows. You couldn't run them full screen, and they were great. They were perfect adaptations. And then I would say my first real experience. What was my first real experience with emulation? I know there was something. There was always toying around with emulation on the Amiga. They were trying to make like an Atari ST emulator for the Amiga. I think someone even tried to make like a early Mac emulator for the Amiga, which never really seemed to work very well. But my first thing, once the internet came about, right, and people started sharing their ideas, my first emulation on the internet came about. I would say it was a thing called the Dave Spicer arcade emulator, and it was called Sparcade for short. And I think it emulated like Galaxian, and at a certain point, Pac-Man. And that was my first experience. And then I had actually, because I had a laptop, and a lot of people didn't have laptops back then, I was emailing the guy and saying, listen, the timing's off when I play these things on my laptop. And apparently it had to do with the screen refresh rate, because he was timing the emulation with refresh rates on monitors. And because a laptop at the time did not have anything close to a standard refresh rate, I ended up becoming one of the testers for it. So he would send me the code early to test. And that was it. And from there, it grew to MAME. And then, of course, like the first Atari 2600 emulator would come out, and then the NES emulator. And there were many moments in the 90s where like my brain would explode, where things that seemed impossible became possible. I remember literally sitting down at my computer when the first Super Nintendo emulator came out, and you could run, I guess it was Super Mario World, and you could just get it to run the title screen. And I remember thinking super nerdiness. I remember looking to a friend, or maybe even just saying to myself, we are through the looking glass. Seeing that screen, this Nintendo screen, Super Nintendo screen, show up on my computer. But boy, once it started, like they were off to the races, because people were sharing ideas. And so once you got this idea of open sourcing and going back and forth, and then of course the greatest emulator, which was MAME, the multiple arcade machine emulator, came out, and then that really took what the Dave Spicer arcade thing did, and again continued to do the impossible and the impossible. And of course, because I was an Amiga guy, they came out with a thing called UAE, which was originally the unusable Amiga emulator, because no one ever thought you could emulate all those custom chips working in tandem. But also because computer chips and computers got so fast and so powerful, everything that seemed impossible became possible, and it just kept growing. Yeah.
Well, what's funny to me, like you were so in on the ground floor there, because I remember
Yeah.
I didn't find out about it, I don't think, until around like 2000. Like
Yeah.
my buddy, because I've always been behind the times on technology. Even the laptop I'm recording on right now is like, it's a MacBook from like 2017 or something. It's old. It's not, it's refurbished. I'm happy with that. But I had a 386 and then a 486 like in the mid 90s, and my buddy came in, he's like, this is unacceptable. He's like, I just upgraded. He's running Linux. He's doing all this stuff. So he's like, I'm giving you my Pentium 1 processor, my original, so you're going to have something that's actually functional. So you can do AOL Messenger, all this stuff. It's like, I was always behind. By 2000, I get the word about emulation. I'm like,
Yeah.
you could play Nintendo games on your computer? Because I had long since like given my Nintendo to my niece and all this stuff.
Of
And so, yeah, I remember for me, it was like playing Mega Man and Ghosts and
Oh,
Goblins and just like jumping in on all those. But I want to get back real quick. You've been
yeah.
mentioning the Amiga a lot.
Yes.
So was there
Yeah.
a particular game from the Amiga that you were looking to play? Like that was the nostalgia button for you?
Let me see. What was, believe it or not, there were a lot, look, there were a lot of great games for the Amiga. There was a thing called Barbarian Combat, which I think in the United States may have been renamed to something else, but it was basically a fighting game with two barbarians with swords. And it was very simple. Again, the Amiga generally just had a single use Atari controllers. And so you would have one button and a joystick. And my friends and I used to play the hell out of this thing. And it was very funny because if you could get the right move, this is before Mortal Kombat, you could swing your sword, whatever, but you would cut them down eventually. But if you got the right move, there was this big swirl move where you would chop the other guy's head off. The head would plop down. And to add insult to injury, this little short little lizard would walk across the screen, kick the head off the screen, and drag the body off.
That's amazing. Wow.
It was so good. Um, I've gone back to play that one in recent years. It's good for like one or two. It's good for a chuckle. But the one game, believe it or not, that I still play at the holidays with friends, they did an adaptation of an old war game, a card game that I played in my D&D days called Nuclear War, which was a card game with a spinner and chips and all this other stuff. But it was a company called Flying Buffalo. There was an adaptation of it done for PC and for Amiga. The Amiga one was better. And we'll still play it because it's a single player version of this game we used to play as kids, and it's still fun, and it's very simple, but it's sort of like playing like Monopoly on a board, it's never gets too complicated. And so it doesn't also get old, it doesn't get dated. And so we'll literally pull that out, and play a few games of that every year when I'm back home. It's fun.
That's
But that was
great.
probably it. Weirdly enough, because the Amiga was known for graphics, but that's the thing. But I'll also go back, because I also was sort of in touch with hackers from Australia. We would exchange things, I guess games. So, which is probably not right to say, but yeah. So I knew these hackers in Australia, and they would make these demos of like pushing these music demos where they would just basically make music and graphics. And so the demo disc, I've gone back to play the demo disc, and sometimes the music on them is actually really good. Some of these guys were real composers. And so just to sort of experience that sort of techno wave music through the original Amiga stuff, I've used the emulators for that. So yeah,
Well,
that's been a lot of
this
fun.
is what I wanted to get into a little bit. Just how
Yeah,
deeply into emulation were you involved? Because you're the type of person, from all that we see, is you get
yeah,
interested in something and then you get involved in the thing.
yeah,
Were
that's
you
true.
creating emulated games? Like, what were you doing?
No, I mean, look, my skill level as a programmer was limited. I had some skill level. I remember one of the big things I did, I did this on the Commodore 64. I programmed, there was a game, well, everybody knows the game Ultima Online, all these things. Well, Ultima 4 was called the Avatar, which was the first game where you couldn't just go kill everybody, where the whole point of the game was to be good, which was counterintuitive to like every sort of adventure battle games before that. And I remember being very frustrated by it. I was like, I don't want to be an avatar. I want to go out and kill everybody. But I was playing around with programming in BASIC and then using some machine language code things. So I figured out how to program a character editor for Ultima 4. And then I used a thing called Blitz Basic, which would compile your basic programming into something faster. So it would actually run at a decent speed. I remember I spent probably months on this character editor. So you could go in and you could change all your possessions, all your stats. And then I manually on the disk, because these disks didn't have files, I would go through with this disk editor and I changed all of the ocean tiles to to basically streets. So instead of having to get this ship, which always gets stolen away, you could walk across the ocean and just grab the port. But as far as like programming emulation, no, I was never a programmer. I will say that when I found pinball emulation, there was a thing called virtual pinball. I did work on one of the table recreations and tried to get into the text programming language of it, but I just could never wrap my head around the programming language of it. But there was a thing called Twin Win, which was these were recreating original pinball machines, and there's a thing called Twin Win from Bally, and it had these two spinners up top. So when the ball would hit, it would kind of go crazy. And so I worked with a guy who had the machine. He was sending me photos of the pieces and I was redrawing them. And that was very early on in pinball emulation, but since they've way exceeded all that. So for a hot second, I had contributed a little bit, a little snippet to that world, but otherwise I was an early adopter and a passionate, obsessive follower of the field. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you did mention earlier you're connecting with these hackers in Australia, right? So
Yeah.
this was the thing, especially the early internet. Obviously, it
Yeah.
exists all over the place now, but like the idea of the dangers of downloading anything from the early internet, especially
Yeah.
emulator software, that's what I was always hearing about from my friends. Like, you got to be careful where you're getting it. Like, you're putting this on your personal PC, it's gonna crash it. That was the first time I downloaded, I was so scared I was gonna get in trouble, right? So, to your knowledge and your experience, were there a lot of viruses being hit in this stuff? Were there a lot of problems?
In my experience, there weren't. Maybe because I was early on, maybe because I would really always go to the source of people, you know. So I sort of, you know, if you're, I guess because I was an early enough adopter, I got there before all the, because virus people, they'll always go to everything that's popular. Maybe I was getting to things before them. What I would say is, like, if you were looking to download the ROMs, right, especially early on, if you wanted to find them on the regular internet, any place you were going to find them on the regular internet was a bad place to go, right?
Yeah.
And so you'd find these like Russian websites. Oh yeah, you can get every Nintendo cartridge, amazing. Just visit our website, you know, whatever. You go there, and inevitably they'd be like trying to jam stuff into your browser. So you'd be getting like, you know, porn messages or whatever on your
Yeah.
browser. So, yeah. So that was one thing I was aware of. But I had all that stuff through other means anyway, so I was able to avoid a lot of those pitfalls, I guess.
Other means.
Other, but that's true. I'd say that's, to my knowledge, that's where a lot of that came from. It's just the fact that these ROM sites were always, you know, these are always sketchy places, right? It was like the digital version of going to buy drugs. You know, you had to walk into like a seedy alley, the seedy digital alley to get your, you know, to get your Mega Man X ROM.
Well, and that's my question. So, is there a difference between emulation and a ROM? Like,
Uh, No, well, the ROM is, so it's interesting. So to make emulators work, you had to get the code off of the original chips, right?
yeah,
And so with a car with a home system, that's a cartridge, and you would just get the ROMs. So you'd be emulated. The emulator would be the actual system, right? They would emulate the chips inside the Nintendo or the Atari. The ROM then is just the program, right? The program information, which would come in the cartridge. So guys would work to pull the information off of the ROM. Um, where arcade emulation is concerned with the MAME guys, because I've been following that thing since it started. What's fascinating with that is arcade games were also being pirated at times, right? When they were new. So like some Chinese company would go out and they would say, okay, Galaxian is out. We're going to take that apart. We're going to copy those ROMs off of there and plug them into our own fake ROMs, and we're just going to sell that game. Just in the same way pirates do it. They were literally doing it in arcades. So undoubtedly, if you were around in the 80s and you went to some grocery store or gas station, you probably played a pirated ROM arcade game, right? Because they were everywhere. I know I had them in my hometown. Um, so there was a point at which the arcade manufacturers, I think toward the 90s, what they would start to do is when you have this circuit board, they would basically pour what would it be, like a plasticine, like a lucite over it. So you couldn't actually get to the ROMs without tearing apart the board. So there were guys then in the MAME community, they would say there's this rare board, whatever, Mortal Kombat 4, whatever it is, you know, and they would use chemicals to dissolve these things to get to the chips underneath because there was no way to get, or they would get, because it would all be you know, it'd all be protected. So they would either hack the protection or they would actually have guys really dissolve all this stuff to get to these protected ROM boards. So it became not just a digital world thing, it became a physical world thing. So following the emulation thing was really, you know, I, in my field of like trying to preserve the past of like old packaging and everything, there is a lot of archaeology to it. And with the emulation preservation community, there's some of that as well, some of the actual physical getting in there and pulling stuff out. So that's a much longer question than is ROM and emulation. But yes, the ROM is essentially what feeds the emulator. But of course, ROMs can also be used for the actual system. I mean, you know, people have programmed ROMs. They've made new ROMs for the Nintendo. They made new ROMs for the Atari 2600. So the ROM is essentially just the software. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about as well, because another thing that was coming up around this time, again, like, mid 2000s internet that I was hearing
Yeah.
about a lot, especially there's a site, iMockery, Raj was running
Oh,
that over there, and
one
he
of
was
my
always
pals.
doing these
Great guy.
reviews of the ROM hack games, and they had
Yeah.
been modified. They were adding crazy characters, lots of foul language and bad ideas, But what is the big difference between a ROM hack and an emulation?
Oh yeah, a ROM hack typically is still using emulation, right? Typically, although you could use the original system. So a ROM hack, they would take like the original Super Mario Brothers ROM, which is just the program, and you could take it and you could plug it right into that Nintendo emulator and it would run, or you could drop that onto your computer and start tweaking with things. And what they would do is they would say take like the Super Nintendo, or they would take like a Super Mario ROM and they would like add Sonic into it, right? And say they would start to make their own maps and games and characters. Again, rude and crude, but also bringing in other pop culture characters, making new levels. It was really the sort of customization that would become a lot more mainstream, in the more like first person shooters where everyone was adding new levels and all these other things and Steam, and that all became sort of legitimized. But early on, there were these guys, and still guys are out there doing custom ROMs of things. So you go in there and they would be exploring the ROMs. They would find like hidden levels or unfinished code that was still on the cartridge that went into stores that you could never access. But when these guys got their hands on it, they were finding these things and they were uncovering these things. So that was really fascinating too. So yeah, the customization, the ROM hacks were always really interesting, and the cheats. The emulators themselves would add cheats, as if pausing wasn't a cheat enough, right? They would do things called save states, because some of these games. I remember we had a game called Solomon's Key on the Nintendo, and I remember a buddy of mine. It was 100 levels, but there was no save, right? There was no battery back save. There was no code to save your location, right? So because it would took forever to get through these levels, and you could sort of restart as long as you never turned your Nintendo off.
Yeah.
And so I remember there was one time I think we kept our Nintendo on with Solomon's Key in it for one game for like 3 weeks, just trying to get before we finally gave up on a level and we're like, fuck this, it's just too hard. And we finally turned off the Nintendo and allowed other people to play their games on it. Like it was bonkers. So emulation also gave us that. It gave us cheats, which were not ROM hacks. They were cheats literally in the emulator themselves to allow different things. And sometimes they would go in and specifically cheat things. But yeah, so there was all that kind of stuff too. Like we're going to make it so Mario has unlimited lives or has a super long jump, or you're going to give Mario Luigi's jump powers and all this, all this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of that, which was fun. Sometimes took the challenge away from the games, but in other cases gave you a whole different game, which is absolutely true.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
thing that comes to mind with that too, as well, is you were kind of mentioning earlier, we are, and you specifically, but just in our world now, we are in a preservation of these historic gaming documents. Like all the Ninja Turtles games just came out. You could download it for the Switch. We bought that at my house. It's just like, oh, and it has all the scans of all the ads and everything else that ever came with it. Those types of things. But in this era, 80s, 90s, 2000s, like if it's not new, we don't care. If it's not the new product we can sell, the manufacturers, the companies don't care. And
Yeah,
so my question though is, Napster comes around, they care about that music being shared. Do you
sure.
ever remember any like controversy, like, hey, you can't sell our games even though we're not currently selling them or offering them, or not
Oh,
selling, I guess, but you can't distribute them? Yeah.
I think Nintendo specifically has been very protective of their IP, and they've been very anti-emulator. Because even though there's games like they're still selling us, right, the original Super Mario Brothers, right, in various forms.
Yeah.
It'll come. Pac-Man still gets resold. But it's taken them a long time to do that. So they're very particular. Other people have been sort of laissez-faire about it. Unlike music, many games do sort of wear out their ability to generate income. There's only like the old game Phoenix from Centauri, I believe, who made it. But no, those games, like, who's going to make money on that? You might be able to sell that to somebody, and people do still come out with arcade packages. But but no, Nintendo has always been hardcore. Only recently, I think last month, the App Store for Apple finally lessened the restrictions on emulators. There's now an emulator that can play Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 on, I think it's called D-Emulator or something, on the App Store legally. You have to get the ROMs yourself, right? And you should own them. Own them. Eh. But to play it, but yeah, that's legal on the App Store finally. And so yeah, there's always been lots of people going after the ROM sellers. I seem to remember, God, what was it? There was it a PlayStation emulator on Dreamcast, I think? That you could pop a disc in there, or was it like there was some emulator on one of the early 2000 systems that allowed you to play something, and someone came after them and made them stop doing that. So there was stuff like that as well. But yeah, Nintendo more than any other company has protected their IP, protected has fought against emulation because they see it as piracy. And look, they because they tend to market lower tech systems cleverly, the Nintendo Wii, which was incredible, but was way lower powered than a lot of the other consoles out at the time. That got emulated while that system was still being sold and still people were buying new games. And that got emulated like almost fully on PC where you could play things at full speed. So that had to be a concern for them. I think now the Nintendo Switch is emulated. It's very complicated, but there are people able to play Nintendo Switch games, which is these games are still being sold on their PC, and that is a legit concern. Um, as I said, I was part of the virtual pinball community for a long time, and they had a rule not to recreate a game that was less than 10 years old, I think. So that was sort of their built-in mantra and their own moral code they infused. So that really wouldn't happen. So yeah, so there are things like that that happen. So insofar as your question, yes, there's still issues with it. People still take issue with it because piracy is always the sort of negative connotation to emulation, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the thing is, like you say though, it's been 30 years since it really broke mainstream and a lot of people can
Yeah.
find it. What do
Yeah.
you think has been the major evolution in emulation? What is it that still is it the preservation aspect, or is there another element just like how much you can truly do?
I think I think the legitimization of emulation has been wild to see. Like I think I want to say 20 was it 20 years ago, 25 years ago, before it was Windows 95, my brother built an arcade cabinet when people weren't really doing this. He went out and got a real arcade monitor. He has a PC, which is finally starting to break down, but that PC runs Windows 95, right? But that's running a 20-year-old version of MAME. And every Christmas we'll go back and we'll play all the arcade games. He had an original arcade control panel built, 4 joysticks, real arcade buttons. But at the time that was something very few people had. It was something only the hacker people did and they built, and so, but now you can go into Walmart and you can get an arcade one up. They're coming out with systems, they're not as good as that, they're not as big or whatever, but they're great, right? So people can populate their dens, their man caves with these arcade machines, with these things, right? And they're awesome. They really are. So they play them with their kids. And so that to me is one of the biggest changes. It's really the legitimization, and finding ways to market stuff. Like Arcade One Up has figured out a way to replicate an original arcade cabinet in a way that's affordable so that they can sell it at a rate that's not crazy. It's not $1,000, right? So to me, that's the biggest change. But I'll still, all of the original sort of emulation challenges are still being made. People are still trying to figure out ways to emulate the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and like the Xbox 360 emulation. Watching that now is like watching the original Atari or Nintendo emulators. Like, oh, it'll run one game and kind of crappily. For me, like a big thing about like watching the Dreamcast emulators come out and finally be able to play the games. There's one game I will play for the rest of my life on Dreamcast emulators because I love it. And so I'm waiting for them to like make it so you can play it online, or for someone to just make a home. There's a thing called San Francisco Rush 2049. There's a 4-player battle mode they made up for the home version, which I will play till the day I die. It's so good. But no, to answer your question, yes, legitimization, I would say for me, is what I've seen as the sort of big change. The preservation of everything, I mean, look, that's what so much of what I do is about, and that's what's still happening, you know. I mean, like with Arcade One Up, people will go out there, they'll get these things, they'll put them in their man caves along with sometimes they'll get a TV and a VCR. So then, you know, and of course you see old media is big, right? Vinyl, VHS. This goes hand in hand, I think, with a lot of that stuff. So it's fantastic. But I do think the work that these people were doing, you know, especially the early work, these guys going out and finding an arcade machine that still had workable ROMs, because a lot of those things, if you let them sit too long, they will die. A lot of them had battery-backed RAM ROMs or something, so that if you got to it after the battery had died, the ROM just sort of flitted away into the digital ether. So the preservation work, the archaeology that was done for a lot of this stuff has been amazing. And but now we're at a point where it's so legitimized, it's so established, there's so much known. The MAME guys early on figured out how to emulate like the 6800 chip or the 68,000 chip, you know. And so once that work had been done, those chips were in everything. So then other people could look at their work and build on it. So I don't know, but that's it. Yeah,
Well, and that's
legitimization.
what I'm wondering as we close out here,
Yeah.
because again, you're an early adopter, you're fraternizing, you're talking to these people. Ultimately, what do you think is the philosophy behind the emulation? You know, because again, a company might see it as, oh, it's piracy, you know,
Oh yeah,
it's
sure.
illegal and there's a danger
Yeah.
behind it, or is it just legitimate like love of these things and wanting to preserve them and wanting to be able to play them? Like what's the percentage, do you think, passion versus piracy?
I mean, I think piracy is the after effect. I think the people going into the program, their desire is is the desire of people to hold on to these things, right? Some of it is academic. Some people just, I think most of it, and this is me really just guessing, because for me, so much of my passion for the things I've gone on to preserve always started with personal nostalgia, right? Like I loved this thing, and and now it's gone, and I have no way to re-experience it, right? Like there's a song that I wanted to hear, and now it's gone, right? It's lost. Um, and so for me, I think a lot of these things have started with, well, I loved this thing. I don't want it to go away. I want a way to continue to re-experience it. I think it starts there. And then I think a lot of people, once they get into it, they're like, oh no, like I have to figure out a way to preserve all of this because someone out there is going to want to remember this. Or someone who just loves programming and video games, we're going to want to know why these things existed. And, you know, for so much of media and pop culture, there was machinery set up to preserve these things. There's not a lot of I say that though, you know, I say there's not a lot of music or film that's lost, but of course there are, right? Early film, there's been big efforts in Hollywood to preserve early film, right? And you do see similar concerns there, right? You have to get to it before it is lost, right? Before the celluloid is lost. Um, and certainly early music, you know, and the old wax rolls, you know, and these things, right? So preservation of those things. So you do see similar efforts from an academic standpoint. Um, but emulation very quickly is, you know, is a practical thing. There may not be that many people who want to watch an old movie, but people still want to play the original Pac-Man, at least for a little bit, right? They want to re-experience that. And those things, of course, with Nintendo, of course, look, Mario is, he just had like a huge movie, right? You know, the early Mario games, they may not be as vibrant as the current Mario games, but people still like playing those things. They still like finding those warp pipes, you know. um, and people are still playing them. People are still figuring out ways to like, you know, single play, fast play through these things, and they're still finding ways to tweak those things. Um, so yeah, but I do think from the people on the ground, it's not about piracy ever. You know, it's almost always about we just have to find a way to do this, you know, and I do think with computers in a broad sense, people who love to toy with computers and play with computers, there's a fascination with wanting to see if it can do something, right? Can it do this thing? You see that actually in retro computing, you do see people like trying to make a web browser on the Commodore 64. Like guys are out there still doing that, right? Which is wild. Oh, I made a web browser. It can get, you know, it can get to the Yahoo front page on a Commodore 64. I just read an article about how someone took generative AI and created a generative AI program on the Commodore 64 to create 8 pixel sprites. It takes like 3 hours or 3 days or something to do it, but it can do it. So you can take this modern software and get it to run on this old 8-bit computer. So I think there's some of that involved. Like for me, I think some emulation is just to watch it run, right? I love the fact that it can do it, right? Can we make this thing do this thing it was never meant to do? That's fascinating to me. But being a kid of the 80s, I'll still go back at Christmas, especially when I can play it on my brother's fully authentic arcade build. I'll still go back. I'll play Robotron. I'll play a game called Zookeeper, which was a Tato game or a Tatio game, which I'm obsessed with. I'm still in the high scores are saved, right? So I'm still going back trying to get my high score. I've been doing this for 20 years, but I played that thing in the arcade, spent so many quarters, and now the dream of being able to play it at home is literally a sketch I drew up in grade school. Like this is going to be my arcade room in my house, right? Of course, now we have it, now it's on our computers and our TVs, we can play these games, but yeah, these are in many ways adolescent dreams fulfilled. But from an academic standpoint, absolutely, man, preservation. I think game programmers in the future will love to be able to revisit these things, see what they did. And as we go forward, provided we aren't all just taken over by AI, people will still be re-experiencing these things that otherwise might be lost, because the companies aren't preserving them, or they weren't, necessarily. So yeah. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
it is. It's wonderful, yeah, that everybody is there using their skills, having
Yeah.
fun while they're doing it, and then yeah, sharing it with the world. It's a very fun, exciting topic that you have brought to us here, Jason.
It's
Uh,
it's wild to me that it in many ways it's wild to me that it continues on. Like I would have thought once you got sort of all the 80s and 90s games, once you could emulate every Street Fighter versus X-Men, that it would sort of stop, and it really hasn't. It's evolved in ways I didn't expect. I don't know if you've seen the mini arcade cabinets. They can cost like $200 or $300, but they are literally exact replicas of like a Galaga machine or a Pac-Man machine, and they've got little screens, but they are running emulation in there. They're probably running a version of MAME in there. So they did Tempest. So they're doing all this great stuff in formats that I wouldn't have expected. And so that's really amazing to see. No, it's exciting. Now people are bringing back their original Nintendos because they say, oh, this will play original cartridges. So they're making these systems that can play original cartridges because all the old Nintendos are starting to break down. So they're making systems that will play original cartridges, which is madness, which is so beautiful and cool. Yeah. So
Yep.
yeah,
Here we are, a golden age for sure for all that preservation.
we are. Yeah, it's true.
But speaking of the preservation, Jason, this is your business. This is what you do.
Yes.
So tell people, we teased a little bit up top, but what are you excited about right now? What are some projects coming up that people can look out for?
I'm most excited about my storytelling work right now, which is the storytelling of these brands. I am a brand archivist and packaging archivist. I've been able to work on this show on History Channel for the last 5 years called The Food That Built America. We are still telling stories. Our fifth season, I think, is on hiatus. There's 4 episodes that have yet to air, and I'm not sure if they're going to run after this little mini season of Mega Brands, but we're doing a season of Mega Brands that built America, which is a shorter episode show. Um, and funnily enough, there's been all this talk about Unfrosted, the Pop-Tart story. 2 years ago on the Food That Built America, we told the Pop-Tart story. So I always like to plan a flight. First of all, I love Unfrosted. I thought it was great. But we sort of actually told the factual version as closely as we could get it of that story. So these are the things I'm excited to keep telling those stories. I'm out now talking to brands and consulting with brands. I just got to go to Chicago and speak to the Nerds Candy Brand team for a day and got to take part in something they call product ideation. So I got to sit with the people from all the divisions that work on the Nerds brand, everything from the factory to the marketing people to the food scientists. And I got to sit with them and help come up with ideas for like the next 4 years of the Nerds brand. And so I get to sit with all these boards. I can't say too much. I can't say anything specific of what we were doing, but they had all these because I signed NDAs, but there was like 100 ideas on all these boards. And so we were voting and picking down things. And we were all coming, I got to contribute ideas. Of course, my ideas were all like, we should do a retro thing. I knew where my ideas were going to be, right? Like, let's bring back this old flavor.
Neon nerds, we need them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I was like, what about hot and cool nerds? What about throwback flavors? Hey, we could bring back this flavor. So that was my theme has not changed. I'm just getting different opportunities, I think. But no, so that's the stuff I'm excited about. Getting to sort of take, I like to think that my obsession with all these brands has now evolved to the point where I'm really getting to be a storyteller of their brand, of the brand's histories, but also maybe in some ways the brand's futures. So I'm sort of taking my skill set from my X-Men days, which was a storyteller, and I'm now getting to sort of regraft that onto this stuff. And so all my worlds is sort of coming full circle, which for me is really exciting.
So
Yeah.
awesome. And people can follow your adventures on social media at Collecting Candy, right?
Yeah, I think I'm at Collecting Candy on Instagram. I think I'm at Collecting Candy on Twitter as well. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's the best places to find me.
So check it out, everybody. And Jason, thank you so much for coming and sharing your enthusiasm, sharing this fun story. Again, these hidden worlds, that
Yeah,
they're so bright and shiny now. Like you say, they're out in the world, but what was it like in the early days? Now we know.
sure.
So
Adam, it's always a pleasure to come on, excuse me, and talk with you. So yeah, you do a great job. Thank you.
thank you.
This has been a presentation of Geekster Media.